Oliver stood motionless at the threshold of the grand kitchen in his Greenwich, Connecticut mansion, a sprawling estate known for its historic architecture and suffocating silence. He paused when he saw Julia, the new housekeeper, quietly teaching his 8-year-old daughter Emma how to knead dough on the cold marble counter. For the very first time in what felt like an eternity, his little girl did not lower her eyes or run away, allowing a faint, genuine smile to grace her usually guarded face. "Just go slowly at your own pace," Julia murmured softly, her voice carrying a soothing rhythm that seemed to instantly calm the heavy air around them. Emma leaned closer to her, an action so incredibly rare that Oliver instantly realized something profound within the walls of this grieving house was finally beginning to shift. He noticed this delicate transformation even before his exhausted mind could fully process the weight of what he was witnessing. Knowing Emma never tolerated anyone's physical presence for more than a few minutes. Throughout that entire morning, the young girl remained steadfastly by Julia's side, her small hands covered in white flour, as she listened to every single gentle instruction without breaking eye contact or searching for an excuse to retreat. The vast kitchen, which for the past 12 months had served only as a sterile space for rapid, joyless meals and unbearably long silences, suddenly felt entirely different, simply because the child was breathing without her usual agonizing tension. Julia made absolutely no attempt to impress anyone, nor did she overwhelm the fragile girl with excessive questions, or treat her like an incredibly difficult burden that needed to be solved. She merely spoke the necessary words, offering quiet guidance, and patiently waited for Emma to find her own internal timing without any external pressure. "Now, press right here, with the heel of your hand," the housekeeper instructed with remarkable calmness, demonstrating the forward motion with a practiced, steady grace. Emma obediently followed the instruction, but misjudged her own strength, staring down at the lopsided, sticky mound of dough and freezing completely for one terrifying second. Oliver recognized that exact moment of hesitation, knowing intimately that it was the precise instance when his daughter would usually throw her hands up, surrender to her frustration, and flee to the absolute safety of her dark bedroom. Yet Julia did not rush or panic, simply pushing the messy dough back to the center and softly saying that perfection was never required, only the brave willingness to continue. Emma took a deep breath and tried one more time, succeeding just enough to make a bright, unforced smile completely break across her pale face, a sight that caused a sudden sharp ache in Oliver's chest. It had been an agonizingly long time since he had seen his daughter express pure joy without obvious exertion, and he slowly stepped back from the doorway to avoid shattering the fragile magic of the domestic scene. However, Emma caught the movement out of the corner of her eye and called out, telling her father to look with a voice that was neither timid nor trapped, but wonderfully alive. Stepping fully into the bright room, Oliver approached the massive kitchen island and observed the tiny, chaotic handprints scattered across the dusting of flour, feeling a strange warmth wash over his perpetually exhausted spirit. He replied softly that he was indeed looking, his voice thick with unspoken emotion, as he added that the homemade bread was shaping up beautifully under her care. Emma straightened her small shoulders with a deep sense of pride, showing him that his paternal approval still mattered deeply to her wounded heart, while Julia simply wiped her hands on her apron without seeking any praise for a task she was never officially hired to do. Julia maintained the exact same unassuming firmness that she had carried since arriving at the sprawling Connecticut estate less than 2 weeks prior, never speaking out of turn or complaining about the daunting size of the property. She was never intimidated by the immense wealth surrounding her, possessing a quiet dignity that left Oliver completely uncertain of how to properly categorize her or thank her. Hoping to keep the mood light, Oliver casually commented that the flour seemed to have landed more on the counter than in the actual dough, which earned a generous sideways glance from Julia and a sparkling melodic laugh from his daughter that instantly changed the atmosphere of the entire home. Ever since his beloved wife Claire passed away, absolutely nothing inside that opulent Greenwich mansion had been able to find its rightful place or proper rhythm. The household staff communicated strictly in hushed whispers, distant relatives only visited on exact calendar holidays, and departed early while expensive pediatricians constantly altered their tone of voice whenever they attempted to speak with the deeply traumatized Emma. Oliver had learned to meticulously manage his crushing grief in the exact same manner he managed his corporate empire, filling every single hour of his day with endless meetings and rigid contracts to avoid facing the deafening emptiness of the night. With his daughter, however, absolutely no logical methodology or highly structured schedule seemed to yield any positive emotional results whatsoever. Emma was only 8 years old, but following the tragic loss of her mother, she began existing in a constant state of defensive hypervigilance that thoroughly baffled every adult who tried to offer help. She would desperately seek comfort, and then violently reject it in the very same breath, appearing to grow fond of a new nanny only to suddenly vanish into her room where she would spend countless hours sitting in absolute silence. Several highly recommended caretakers insisted the young girl simply required stricter discipline, while others foolishly attempted to purchase her fleeting affection with towering piles of expensive toys and imported chocolates. One particularly arrogant private tutor even suggested powerful behavioral medications before she had spent more than a few consecutive hours truly getting to know the grieving child. Oliver fired every single one of them without a second thought. But the unfortunate consequence was that Emma's reputation as a completely unpredictable and deeply difficult child began to quietly spread throughout their exclusive social circles. Emma heard far more of these whispered conversations than the adults ever realized, slowly internalizing the painful understanding that people actively wished to avoid her, a devastating realization that wounded her far deeper than she possessed the vocabulary to express. Julia entered this complicated dynamic without any prior knowledge of the local gossip, carrying no hidden agenda, and making absolutely no grand promises about magically healing the broken family overnight. She had been recommended by a retiring estate manager and was hired exclusively to organize the massive house on a full-time schedule, with the explicit understanding that she was a housekeeper, not a certified therapist or a glorified babysitter. On her very first morning, Julia discovered Emma sitting quietly on the cold marble floor of the grand hallway, her small arms wrapped tightly around her knees as she watched the household move around her like a ghost observing the living. Julia simply offered a pleasant good morning and was met with absolute stony silence, a reaction she accepted without a single hint of visible frustration or unfair judgment. When the exact same heavy silence greeted her on the second day, she simply nodded respectfully and went about her duties. But on the third day, she sat down on the opposite side of the sprawling corridor to sort her cleaning supplies. Without staring directly at the highly defensive child, Julia casually remarked that the highly polished floors of the massive home seemed to show every single scuff and mark no matter how carefully someone walked. Emma, without lifting her chin from her knees, softly muttered her very first sentence to the new employee, stating flatly that the entire house showed absolutely everything. From that incredibly tiny, unassuming interaction, an organic and entirely pressure-free connection began to blossom, leading directly to the profound moment at the kitchen counter that Oliver now recognized as a monumental psychological breakthrough. Calling her name softly, Oliver prompted the housekeeper to look up from the ceramic bowls she was steadily washing in the deep brass sink. He told her she could leave the lunch preparations for later, firmly insisting that if she would like to finish this baking project with his daughter, she should take all the time she needed. Her response was beautifully simple, and devoid of any performative pretense, stating honestly that she truly wanted to stay and finish the task. Emma immediately looked back and forth between her father and the housekeeper, as if desperately trying to verify that these two adults were actually in complete agreement, without any hidden arguments. The little girl asked if she could make the entire loaf of bread by herself, her voice carrying a fragile thread of newfound hope and genuine curiosity. Julia assured her that she absolutely could, but gently warned her that she would have to practice patience while waiting for the sticky dough to properly rise. Emma furrowed her brow, fully absorbing the information, before firmly declaring that she was entirely willing to wait, leaving Oliver utterly astounded, as he could not recall the last time his daughter had agreed to wait for anything without collapsing into a tearful, frustrated meltdown. By the end of the morning, the heavy dough was finally placed into the warm oven, and the comforting, rich aroma of baking bread completely filled the sprawling kitchen. Emma stood perfectly still before the glass door of the oven, her small hands firmly planted on the counter, watching the miraculous expansion of the loaf with absolute, unwavering fascination. While Julia quietly washed the remaining utensils, the young girl peppered her with short, curious questions, asking if the bread always grew exactly like that, and what would happen if it suddenly failed to rise. Julia offered a warm, over-the-shoulder smile, explaining that if the dough was good, it would rise, and if it failed, they would simply learn what ingredient was missing and bravely try again. Emma absorbed this profound life lesson, masquerading as a simple cooking tip, with the utmost seriousness, quietly asking the housekeeper if she knew how to do absolutely everything perfectly. Julia gently laughed, admitting she certainly did not know everything. But she did know how to keep trying until things eventually worked out, a phrase Oliver mentally recorded as he pretended to check vital emails on his phone. When the lunch hour finally arrived, a highly unusual event took place that sent a ripple of quiet shock through the meticulously observing household staff. Emma explicitly demanded to sit at the massive formal dining table instead of hiding in her usual isolated corner, and she specifically requested that Julia stand nearby to witness the inaugural slicing of their culinary creation. Upon receiving the very first warm slice, the little girl carefully smelled it, tentatively touched the golden crust, took a measured bite, and then looked directly into her father's waiting eyes. She proudly declared that she had made it, and Oliver immediately nodded in absolute agreement, verbally affirming her hard work and newfound domestic confidence. However, the child paused for 2 thoughtful seconds before gently correcting herself, stating firmly that they had made it together, marking the very first time in countless months that she had willingly included another human being in her personal victories. Julia remained standing respectfully near the doorway, her hands neatly folded over her clean apron, but the look in her dark eyes had shifted from polite professionalism to deep, genuine, and protective care. Unfortunately, the wonderful news of Emma's sudden emotional improvement did not take long to severely irritate certain people who thrived on constantly maintaining strict control over the family narrative. Later that afternoon, Oliver's overbearing sister, Tara, arrived completely unannounced, storming through the heavy front doors in her expensive designer heels, enveloped in a cloud of suffocating perfume and absolute certainty that she always knew best. Tara loved her brother in her own rigid, complicated way, but she possessed a toxic habit of treating genuine family affection as if it were a strict corporate administration that required aggressive micromanagement. After greeting Oliver with a brisk, performative kiss on the cheek, Tara immediately scanned the room, her piercing gaze stopping dead when she spotted Emma happily sitting at the kitchen table drawing, while Julia peacefully dried the remaining dishes. She asked if the child was in there in a sharp tone that suggested she had just discovered a terrible scandal, rather than a peaceful domestic scene, to which Oliver calmly confirmed that his daughter was indeed there. and doing exceptionally well. Ignoring his positive tone, Tara marched straight toward her young niece with a falsely sweet greeting that instantly made the atmosphere in the room drop several degrees in temperature. Emma briefly looked up, offered a remarkably polite response, and immediately returned her absolute focus to her colorful drawing, making it painfully obvious that her attention was safely anchored to the quiet housekeeper standing nearby. Tara instantly recognized this shifted dynamic and despised it sharply, suggesting to her brother that he ought to take the child to the country club or arrange playdates with children of their own elite social standing. She coldly proclaimed that such domestic isolation was terribly unhealthy, prompting Oliver to instantly lose any desire to continue the conversation, flatly reminding his sister that he had tried countless failed social interventions already. Refusing to concede defeat, Tara crossed her arms and audibly scoffed loudly, suggesting that perhaps what the grieving child truly lacked was a firm, uncompromising hand to enforce proper discipline. Throughout this passive-aggressive assault, Julia simply continued drying a porcelain plate, as if she were completely alone in the room, refusing to compete for space or artificially inflate her own importance. Her incredible stoicism seemed to infuriate Tara even further, prompting the wealthy woman to directly interrogate the housekeeper about who had baked the bread, to which Emma fiercely replied that she and Julia had done it together, completely preempting any adult interference. Tara offered a remarkably tight, utterly humorless smile, dramatically turning back to her brother to deliver a veiled warning disguised as helpful family advice about appropriate household boundaries. She loudly cautioned Oliver to be extremely careful not to confuse professional duties just because his deeply sensitive daughter had formed a sudden unhealthy attachment to the hired help. Hearing her own name spoken with such sharp condescension, Emma immediately dropped her colored pencil, her small shoulders pulling completely tense, prompting Julia to finally intervene with an incredibly calm, non-confrontational grace. Stating softly that the child was simply drawing a picture and enjoying her bread, Julia caused a heavy, suffocating silence to instantly descend upon the massive, luxurious kitchen. Tara, completely unaccustomed to being directly addressed by household staff, glared fiercely coldly, declaring that she knew exactly what she was witnessing with her own two eyes. Julia held the imposing woman's hostile gaze without a single flinch, calmly replying that if Tara was truly looking, she would clearly see a little girl who was finally feeling safe and genuinely happy. Sensing the immediate danger of an explosive verbal confrontation, Oliver decisively shut the conversation down, sternly commanding his sister to drop the subject entirely and respect his absolute authority in his own home. Tara understood that she had reached her brother's absolute limit, but she silently refused to back down, pausing critically by the table to inspect Emma's artwork before finally marching out of the house. The drawing beautifully depicted 3 distinct stick figures standing happily beside a long counter, and Tara merely smirked before leaving. But the psychological damage to the fragile environment had already been thoroughly inflicted. That evening, the devastating consequences of the aunt's cruel interference became painfully obvious as Emma once again retreated entirely into her impenetrable shell of profound, heartbreaking silence. During their formal dinner, she listlessly pushed her roasted vegetables around her porcelain plate with a heavy silver fork, speaking less than 10 words throughout the agonizingly long, quiet meal. Just before bedtime, she quietly asked her father to hand her the beautiful drawing she had created earlier that morning, only to violently tear the thick paper into 4 separate pieces and toss them directly into the trash bin. Oliver realized what was happening, a fraction of a second too late, dropping to his knees and desperately asking his little girl why she had destroyed something so beautiful and full of hope. Emma merely shrugged her tiny shoulders, whispering that the picture was ugly, and when Oliver fiercely insisted it was perfect, heavy tears immediately welled up in her exhausted, sad eyes. She tightly pressed her lips together and softly confessed that her aunt had warned her that loving things only meant they would eventually be taken away, a devastating echo of the trauma caused by losing her beloved mother. A sudden white-hot wave of protective rage washed over Oliver, directed not at his innocent daughter or the supportive housekeeper, but at the endlessly revolving door of careless adults casually strolling in and out of the child's shattered life. He gently cupped Emma's tear-stained face in his large hands, looking deeply into her eyes, and firmly promised her that absolutely no one was going to magically disappear tomorrow. The little girl simply stared back with a heartbreakingly hollow expression, stating cleanly and without a single sob that her mother had disappeared, a raw, undeniable truth that struck Oliver harder than any physical blow. Reciting the painful belief that people always go away, Emma spoke with the terrifying emotional hardness of an elderly survivor, rather than a sheltered 8-year-old child living in affluent Connecticut. Oliver forced himself to take a deep, stabilizing breath, acknowledging the painful reality while softly explaining that while some people do leave, not everyone vanishes just because you dare to care about them. He solemnly promised that he was staying forever. And when Emma fearfully asked about Julia, Oliver swore on his life that as long as he had breath, no one would ever strip the housekeeper of her right to treat his daughter with kindness. The very next morning, however, began far worse than Oliver could have ever anticipated, immediately plunging him into a chaotic international corporate crisis that required his absolute undivided attention. Simultaneously, Emma's prestigious private school demanded an emergency pedagogical meeting, while Tara bombarded his phone with dozens of frantic text messages insisting the housekeeper was a dangerous emotional liability. By the time Oliver returned to his sprawling estate in the late afternoon, he was greeted by a terrifying, heavy silence, soon discovering from a terrified maid that Tara had returned and aggressively ordered Julia to pack her bags and leave the property forever. Racing up the grand wooden staircase, Oliver frantically searched for his daughter, finally locating Emma, curled into a tight ball on the floor of her late mother's massive, untouched walk-in closet. Her pale dress was heavily wrinkled, indicating she had been hiding in that exact miserable position for several hours, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying return of her absolute worst abandonment fears. Dropping to his knees, he desperately asked if she had been the one to send Julia away, to which the child sobbed into her knees that the other adults had made the horrible decision completely for her. Realizing that empty platitudes would permanently destroy whatever fragile trust remained between them, Oliver spoke with absolute uncompromising honesty, admitting his massive failure in allowing outsiders to dictate their family's delicate healing process. He gently coaxed the weeping girl to her feet, promising that they were going to fix this terrible mistake immediately, though his own heart pounded with the fearful realization that he knew almost nothing about Julia's personal life. They quickly walked toward the small staff quarters, stopping dead in the narrow doorway when they saw the housekeeper quietly and meticulously folding her few meager belongings into an ancient, battered suitcase. There was absolutely no anger on Julia's calm face, only the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire existence graciously stepping aside so others would not be inconvenienced by her mere presence. Oliver stepped firmly into the small room, his imposing frame completely blocking the exit, and demanded to know exactly who had given her the ridiculous order to pack her belongings and abandon her rightful employment. Julia did not feign ignorance, softly explaining that while no one had fired her directly, her lifetime of difficult experiences had taught her to recognize exactly when her continued existence had transformed into an unacceptable burden for a wealthy family. Emma suddenly pushed past her father's legs, her small hands trembling as she grabbed the hem of Julia's simple gray blouse, begging the woman not to leave them completely alone in the enormous, lonely house. Julia knelt down to meet the desperate child at eye level, her own composure finally cracking just a fraction as she softly confessed that she truly enjoyed their time together and desperately wished to stay. But when the housekeeper gently added that survival sometimes depended on avoiding conflict rather than chasing happiness, Oliver stepped forward, his voice vibrating with an entirely new, unyielding authority, declaring that absolutely no one in the house would ever define her relationship with his daughter without coming through him first. Oliver locked his eyes onto Julia's with an intense, unwavering sincerity that shocked her into silence. He firmly stated that if she wished to remain, she would have his full protection, promising to provide written legal authorization to shut down any future interference from his overbearing sister or the school's misguided administration. Recognizing that this wealthy, powerful man was entirely willing to endure extreme social discomfort and familial conflict just to protect her presence, Julia slowly released a breath she felt she had been holding for decades, and firmly agreed to stay. That evening, for the very first time since the tragic funeral, the three of them chose to eat dinner together in the warm kitchen, completely ignoring the massive formal dining room and the endless pinging of Oliver's corporate smartphone. When Emma curiously pointed out that his phone was ringing, Oliver simply flipped the expensive device face down softly, telling his daughter that she was infinitely more important than any international corporate merger. After the comforting meal, Emma bravely asked Julia if she would like to see her mother's preserved bedroom, a sacred, terrifying space the child had violently refused to enter for over 1 year. Oliver's chest tightened with intense anxiety. But he nodded his permission quietly, following the two of them down the long, carpeted corridor and standing guard outside the partially open, heavy wooden door. He watched in silent awe as his brave little girl sat in a velvet armchair, carefully turning the pages of an old photo album, while Julia sat perfectly still beside her, offering quiet, validating murmurs instead of toxic, forced cheerfulness. When Emma tearfully confessed her terrible fear that moving her mother's belongings would erase the precious memories from her mind, Julia gently assured her that keeping things locked away did not bring people back, but finding new ways to remember them could finally banish the fear. Over the following weeks, a beautiful, discreet new routine settled over the mansion, with Emma waking up early to measure flour alongside Julia, while Oliver actively canceled luxury social events to ensure he was home for daily family dinners. However, true change always awakens dormant resistance, and soon vicious rumors began swirling among their elite Connecticut social circle, fueled by Tara's insidious phone calls suggesting the opportunistic housekeeper was manipulating a vulnerable widower. The malicious gossip culminated on a rainy Friday afternoon, when Oliver discovered a thick, unmarked brown envelope resting ominously on his polished mahogany desk, containing deeply concerning legal documents regarding a volatile domestic disturbance from Julia's completely hidden past. The terrifying documents painted a vague but highly sinister picture of a woman constantly fleeing trouble, detailing an ancient restraining order and a chaotic altercation involving her violently abusive ex-husband in a distant, forgotten town. Oliver read the poorly photocopied pages twice, his sharp, analytical mind battling against the sudden protective fury rising in his chest, knowing that hiding this discovery would be a disastrous mistake if genuine danger was truly approaching his home. He carried the damning envelope directly to the kitchen, finding Julia quietly covering a sleeping Emma with a woven blanket, and motioned for the housekeeper to join him in his private office for a gravely serious conversation. Julia reviewed the intrusive papers without a single gasp of theatrical shock, her posture stiffening with the tragic, familiar resignation of a victim who was eternally punished for the unforgivable crime of simply trying to survive. She calmly explained that she had been married far too young to a violently controlling man, and her desperate attempts to escape his terrifying grip had resulted in a relentless, shadowy campaign to destroy her reputation and track her movements. She offered to resign immediately to spare Oliver's family any further danger, but Oliver fiercely refused the offer, declaring that cutting her loose would only teach his daughter that cowardly threats were always stronger than genuine love. Recognizing that the abstract threat had now become a terrifying reality, Oliver immediately hired an elite private security firm to heavily monitor the estate and retained a ruthless attorney, Mr. Harrison, to permanently legally sever Julia's past from her present. His swift, uncompromising actions were severely tested just 3 days later when Marcus, the new head of security, urgently reported that a suspicious black vehicle with heavily tinted windows had been idling near the grand wrought iron gates for over 20 minutes. Instead of hiding behind his massive wealth, Oliver walked right out the front door with Julia, confidently by his side, deeply determined to face whatever miserable ghost from her past had dared to cross into their newly built sanctuary. A rugged, menacing man stepped out of the idling vehicle, sneering as he attempted to loudly intimidate the housekeeper, claiming he was sent by her ex-husband to collect a supposed outstanding financial debt and drag her back. Before the miserable thug could even finish his pathetic rehearsed speech, Oliver stepped forward with the cold, terrifying authority of a man who possessed unlimited resources and absolutely nothing left to lose, introducing Mr. Harrison, who was already actively documenting the entire encounter. Oliver calmly informed the trespasser that any further harassment would result in immediate, devastating legal and financial ruin, backing his absolute promise with the imposing silent presence of Marcus and 3 other heavily armed security professionals. The cowardly associate quickly calculated the overwhelming odds, realizing that the isolated, defenseless woman his boss had relentlessly hunted was now fiercely protected by an impenetrable fortress of immense wealth, legal power, and unyielding devotion. He scrambled back into his dark vehicle and sped away down the winding Connecticut road, permanently severing the toxic chain of fear that had choked Julia's life for over a decade. As the heavy iron gates firmly clicked shut, Emma came running out onto the manicured lawn, fiercely hugging both her father and Julia, simultaneously, implicitly understanding that the terrifying shadows had finally been banished from their home for good. In the peaceful months that followed, the sprawling Greenwich estate completely shed its identity as a cold, silent museum of grief, transforming into a vibrantly loud, incredibly messy, and deeply joyful family home. Emma successfully returned to her rigorous academic schedule, making 2 new best friends named Lily and Chloe, whom she proudly invited over on weekends to completely destroy the kitchen while learning how to bake fresh, imperfect loaves of bread. Oliver permanently restructured his entire corporate empire to prioritize his physical presence at home, discovering that genuine paternal connection could never be outsourced to expensive nannies or hollow materialistic apologies. The deep, quiet romance that naturally blossomed between Oliver and Julia was built on a profound foundation of mutual respect, shared survival, and absolute honesty, completely ignoring the snide, irrelevant whispers of the local high society. One evening, after cleaning up a massive pile of spilled flour, Emma proudly presented her father with a brand new drawing, this one depicting the 3 of them standing shoulder to shoulder, without any gaps or dark spaces between them, only to realize that prolonged isolation is the heaviest burden of all. Healing requires the immense bravery to allow new people to witness our chaotic, unfinished messes, and the steadfast commitment to stand firmly beside them when their own dark shadows threaten to return. Ultimately, a physical house only transforms into a genuine home when the vulnerable people inside it actively choose to stop running from their broken pasts, fiercely protect the fragile hope of the present, and bravely learn how to stay.